Hannah had told herself from the very beginning that it was just biology, that what she was offering wasn't love or emotion or even connection. It was a service, a deeply human one, yes, but a transaction nonetheless. She had read the contracts, signed the paperwork, passed the psychological evaluations with confident detachment. She was clear, rational, emotionally neutral, or so she believed. When she first met Claire and Daniel, the couple she would be carrying a child for, they seemed polished, grateful, and distant. Claire was practical, professional. Daniel, quieter, more observant. During that initial meeting, he didn't say much, just nodded occasionally and thanked her with a voice so gentle it almost disappeared. Hannah didn't pay attention to it then. Why would she? The boundaries were clear. She would carry their baby, attend their doctor visits, keep them informed, and then return to her life. Clean, untangled. But from the moment of implantation, something shifted in her. It wasn't the pregnancy, at least not at first. It was the silence afterward, the space between messages, the cold professionalism that replaced what she had assumed would be warmth. Claire rarely reached out, but Daniel did. Just small things at first. How are you feeling today? Or, did the nausea ease up? Harmless check-ins. Thoughtful, but nothing more. Still, they came consistently. In the quiet of her apartment, those texts became small anchors. She responded cautiously, always aware of the line. But she began to look forward to them. Not for validation, not for attention, but because they made her feel seen. And then came the first visit. Claire was out of town. Daniel offered to accompany Hannah to the appointment. She almost said no, but when she saw him waiting in the lobby, holding a warm tea and a scarf in case she was cold, something flickered. A kindness that wasn't rehearsed, a care that wasn't contractual. In the exam room, when the heartbeat pulsed through the monitor, Daniel's eyes softened. He didn't touch her. He didn't cross a line. But in that moment, Hannah felt something she hadn't expected. Not desire, not confusion, but the beginning of something dangerously tender, something real, and it terrified her more than the pregnancy ever could. Hannah tried to ignore it. She repeated the same sentence like a mantra every morning. This is not my life. This is not my child. This is not my story. But the words began to feel thin, like fabric worn too many times. Her body was changing, and with it, so was her sense of place. She would catch herself holding her stomach absent-mindedly while making tea or pausing longer than necessary at the sound of lullabies from an ad. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. She knew the hormones could play tricks. Her counselor had warned her of that. But this wasn't just chemical. It was emotional erosion. Slowly, gently, the boundary lines she had drawn in bold black began to blur. Daniel didn't make it easier. He never said anything inappropriate, never crossed a physical line, but he saw her. That was the danger. The way he looked at her, not as a vessel, not as an employee, but as a person, as someone carrying the future, their child. But somehow, it felt like more than that. Their conversations had become longer. After appointments, they'd sometimes sit in the cafe nearby and talk about music, films, little things. He asked about her childhood, her favorite books, her fears. He listened with a softness she hadn't felt in years. And in those moments, Claire faded from view. Not maliciously, not intentionally, just slowly disappeared into the background. Hannah began to notice the way Daniel smiled when she laughed, the way his eyes lingered an extra second when she rubbed her growing belly. It wasn't lust. It wasn't a game. It was something far more dangerous, understanding. Intimacy born not from romance, but from shared presence. She knew it was a line she couldn't cross, but feelings don't ask for permission. They build, in silence, in kindness, in absence. And when she found herself waiting for his messages more than she wanted to admit, when her heart fluttered at the sound of his voice, Hannah realized she was falling. Not fast, not foolishly, but inevitably. The kind of fall that doesn't announce itself. The kind that feels like gravity. And no matter how much she tried to climb back to the rules, the contract, the agreement, her heart had already defected. Quietly, entirely. The moment that changed everything was heartbreakingly simple. They were sitting in the back garden of the clinic after a routine checkup. It was early afternoon. The sky was pale and unthreatening, and the air carried that softness only spring can offer. Daniel had brought a small lunch. He always remembered her strange cravings, and this time it was strawberries and peppered crackers. She laughed as she ate them, admitting it made no sense. He smiled, leaning forward with a gentleness that felt like an echo of something deeper. "You make even cravings look elegant," he said. And then, he froze. So did she. The words had come out too naturally, too honest, too close. It wasn't a compliment. It was a confession he hadn't meant to give. For a full 5 seconds, they didn't speak. The air between them thickened, no longer light. Hannah's heart pounded, not from joy, not from shame, but from the terrifying clarity that something had shifted. She tried to dismiss it. "We're just tired," she told herself. "It's the hormones, the stress, the moment." But deep down, she knew. Something had been said. Not out loud, but with eyes, with breath, with the silence that followed. Daniel quickly changed the subject, pretending it never happened. But his hands trembled slightly as he packed the containers. He didn't meet her eyes when he said goodbye. And Hannah? Hannah went home and cried in the shower. Not because she was ashamed, but because she didn't know how to stop what was beginning. She wasn't the type to fall for someone else's husband. She wasn't reckless, she wasn't selfish. But feelings don't check marital status. They don't ask if a contract has been signed. They simply arrive. And hers had arrived in silence, grown in kindness, and taken root in moments like this, where nothing was done wrong, and yet everything suddenly felt wrong. As the water rushed over her skin, she whispered the only truth she could manage. "I didn't mean for this to happen." But it had. And somewhere deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning of a story far more complicated than she was ready to admit. Days passed without a message. Hannah told herself it was for the best. That distance was healthy, necessary. That what happened in the garden wasn't real. It was a fleeting mistake. But silence has its own way of speaking. And in that silence, everything grew louder. She felt it in the way she lingered over her phone, in the restless pacing of her apartment, in the way her dreams drifted toward scenes she never allowed herself to imagine when awake. She told herself she was fine, that she could recalibrate, that she could be professional again. But nothing felt clean anymore. The line between role and reality had smudged. And then one evening, Claire called. It was rare for her to reach out directly, and Hannah braced herself. But the voice on the other end wasn't sharp. It was soft, distracted. "I think Daniel's having a hard time with all this," she said. "He's been different." Hannah stayed quiet. "I just wanted to check in with you," Claire added. "Make sure everything's okay. With the pregnancy, I mean." Hannah gave the standard updates. Healthy, growing, normal. She didn't ask anything back. She couldn't. When the call ended, Hannah sat in silence for nearly an hour, her heart churning. Claire wasn't suspicious. Not exactly. But something in her tone felt fragile. Tired. Lonely, even. And in that moment, guilt began to bloom. Not because she had done anything explicitly wrong, but because she had felt too much. Wanted too much. She had stepped into a role meant to be physical, medical, detached, and let it evolve into something tangled. That night she tried to write a message to Daniel, to say something, anything, that could bring clarity. But every version of the message sounded wrong. Too cold, too honest, too careful. She deleted them all. Instead, she opened the folder from her last ultrasound. There it was, the tiny figure taking shape inside her. Not hers, not legally, not emotionally either, or so the contract claimed. But Hannah didn't feel detached anymore. She felt full, conflicted, changed. And as she stared at that image, the heartbeat replaying in her memory like a drum, she wondered if she was already too far in to ever come back out the same. 3 days later, she saw him again. Unexpectedly. It wasn't planned, and that made it worse. Hannah had arrived early for her prenatal appointment, hoping to avoid conversation, questions, anything that might pull her deeper into the emotional chaos she'd been trying to suppress. But when the elevator doors opened and she stepped out into the hallway, he was already there, standing alone, holding a folder, looking tired. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them moved. There was no hug, no smile, just a pause heavy enough to make the air feel like water. "Claire couldn't make it," he finally said. "She's stuck at work." Hannah nodded slowly, unsure what to say, unsure whether to stay silent or run, but she didn't move. And neither did he. The receptionist called her name. She walked past him. He followed. In the exam room, the technician dimmed the lights, spread the cool gel on her belly, and turned on the monitor. The baby appeared. Lively, active. A kick. A stretch. A tiny hand waving toward the sound of the probe. Hannah smiled involuntarily. So did Daniel. It wasn't the moment itself that did it. It was the quiet afterward. As the technician printed the images and stepped out, leaving them alone in the low light, neither spoke. Hannah kept her eyes on the screen, though it was already fading. Daniel finally broke the silence. "I'm sorry," he said, voice low. "About the other day." She didn't answer right away. Her throat felt tight. "You didn't do anything," she whispered. "That's the problem," he said. "I didn't, but I wanted to." The honesty dropped between them like a weight. Neither of them dared to touch it. Hannah turned her face toward the ceiling, blinking away something she couldn't name. She felt both seen and invisible, both full and hollow. This wasn't what she wanted, and yet it was exactly what she'd been waiting to hear. Not for validation, but for truth. For something to make sense of the feelings she couldn't control. And for the first time she realized this wasn't a one-sided fall. Daniel had been falling too. Silently, carefully, but undeniably. And now, with months still to go before the baby arrived, they were both in too deep. That night, Hannah couldn't sleep. The ultrasound images sat on her kitchen table, slightly curled at the edges, still warm from the machine hours earlier. She had tried to distract herself, watched a movie, made chamomile tea, even cleaned the apartment. But nothing worked. Her thoughts were too loud, too alive. The memory of Daniel's voice, soft but loaded, replayed like a record skipping at the same painful part. "I didn't, but I wanted to." She didn't know what to do with that sentence. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a request. It was just a truth, raw and unedited, and it changed everything. Not because she had suddenly developed feelings, those had been growing silently for weeks, but because now she knew he had too. She wasn't imagining it. She wasn't alone in the unraveling, and that made it feel both better and worse. She sat on the couch, one hand on her stomach, the other covering her mouth, as if afraid the truth might spill out if she wasn't careful. This wasn't just about attraction. It wasn't about rebellion or desire. It was about connection. Quiet, slow, and deeply human. But it was also betrayal, whether spoken or not. She thought about Claire, about the first meeting in the lawyer's office, the contracts, the eager excitement in Claire's voice when she talked about becoming a mother. And now Hannah was the one feeling the baby kick in the middle of the night, the one talking to it when no one was around, the one sharing glances with the father that meant more than they should. It wasn't fair. To Claire, to Daniel, to herself. But fairness had left the story the moment emotion entered it. She looked out the window, the city dim and slow beneath her, and wondered where the line had gone, the one between right and wrong, between role and reality, between being just the surrogate and whatever she was becoming now. She whispered to the quiet room, "I didn't ask for this," but the silence offered no comfort, only the low hum of life continuing, inside her, around her, without pause or permission. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to stop it. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the first crack appeared on the surface of the arrangement. Claire invited Hannah for lunch, a gesture she hadn't made in weeks. They met at a small cafe near the clinic, the kind with soft lighting and vintage menus that tried too hard to be charming. Claire looked tired but polished, her hair pulled back in its usual no-nonsense bun. She talked about nursery colors, stroller brands, and which lullaby app had the most authentic nature sounds. Hannah smiled when expected, nodded when required, but her mind was elsewhere. It wasn't until halfway through the meal, over a plate of avocado toast, that Claire paused mid-sentence. "You've been quiet lately," she said, tilting her head slightly. "More than usual." Hannah froze for a beat too long. "Just tired," she lied. "Normal pregnancy stuff." Claire smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Daniel's been quiet too." The words landed like a pebble dropped in still water, small but spreading. "Work," Hannah offered. "He mentioned it's been busy." Claire set down her fork. "He doesn't talk about work much with me anymore." And then, quieter. Or about anything, really. Hannah felt her throat tighten. The cafe noise grew louder, more suffocating. Cups clinking. A baby crying 2 tables over. Someone laughing too hard near the door. Claire took a sip of her iced tea and stared into it like it might answer something for her. "Sometimes I wonder if the baby's the only thing holding us together," she said flatly. Hannah wanted to reach across the table, to say something, kind, reassuring. But all she could do was lower her gaze. "That's not true," she whispered. Claire didn't respond. A minute passed, then another. When the check arrived, Claire paid for both without looking up. As they left, she touched Hannah's arm gently. "You're doing great," she said. "Really?" And just like that, the moment was gone. But it lingered in Hannah's chest like a bruise forming under skin. Claire wasn't accusing her, not yet. But the distance between them had changed. It wasn't trust anymore. It was surveillance, dressed as kindness. And Hannah knew. The space she was occupying wasn't just between Daniel and Claire. It was inside the quiet unraveling of a marriage already starting to bend. Later that night, Hannah couldn't shake Claire's words from her mind. "Sometimes, I wonder if the baby's the only thing holding us together." They echoed, looping in her head, bending with meaning. Not because they were dramatic, but because they felt quietly resigned, as if Claire had already accepted a kind of emotional departure she hadn't said aloud. Hannah sat by the window, a blanket draped around her shoulders, watching headlights pass like ghosts across the walls. She thought about how Daniel used to sit on this very couch beside her during appointments, how he'd glance at her when the baby's heartbeat filled the room, how his hand had hovered once, almost touching hers, then pulled back like something sacred. That pull, that hesitation, had haunted her more than any touch would have. But now, the hesitation was fading. Every silence between them felt heavier, every word they didn't say louder. It wasn't just chemistry. It was understanding, familiarity, a quiet rhythm that kept finding its way back, no matter how far they tried to stretch it. That same night, Daniel texted, Just a few words. "Can I drop off the new vitamins tomorrow? Claire's working late." She stared at the message for a long time. It was practical, innocent on the surface. But it wasn't. Not anymore. Every small errand had begun to carry weight. Every delivery was a visit. Every visit, a risk. She typed a simple response. "Okay," then deleted it. Rewrote it. "Sure, no problem." Sent. She placed the phone face down and immediately regretted it. Not because she was afraid of Claire reading it, but because she was afraid of what she was becoming. The woman who measured silence, who waited for moments that never should have been hers. But tomorrow, when he came, there would be no nurse, no paperwork, no buffer, just a doorbell. Just him and her, and a baby neither of them could truly call their own, but which had become the center of a gravity none of them were strong enough to resist. The lines weren't just blurred now, they were vanishing. And Hannah knew, deep in the quiet corners of herself, that the next time he crossed that threshold, something would happen. Something she wouldn't be able to undo. When the doorbell rang the next evening, Hannah stood frozen in her kitchen, her hands still wet from rinsing a glass. She hadn't expected him to come early. She hadn't expected her heart to thump like it did either. She dried her hands quickly, adjusted her sweater, and opened the door. Daniel stood there, holding a small paper bag and a folded piece of paper. "The vitamins," he said with a faint smile. "And Claire wanted you to have the updated appointment schedule." But it wasn't Claire's handwriting on the note. It was his. She took both items, their fingers grazing for a second too long. He didn't ask to come in. She didn't invite him. But the silence between them pulled like a thread, unraveling whatever distance they were pretending to maintain. "Do you want to come in for a minute?" she asked, almost against her own will. He hesitated, then nodded. Inside, everything felt too quiet. The lamp cast a soft gold on the furniture. The couch looked too inviting. The baby kicked just once, then stilled. Hannah offered tea. He declined. They stood there, her by the counter, him near the bookshelf, like actors who forgot their lines. "I didn't mean to make things complicated," Daniel said suddenly, voice low. "But they are," Hannah answered, before she could think. "They've been complicated for a while." He looked at her then, not just glanced, but truly looked, as if he were trying to memorize something he was afraid to forget. "I don't know when it changed," he said. "I just know I feel more present when I'm here." That word, present, hit her like a tide. Because that's what she'd been craving. Not romance, not even clarity. Just presence, realness. And Daniel had been showing up in ways Claire never did. They both knew it wasn't right. But it also wasn't a lie. That moment didn't end with a kiss. It didn't need to. It ended with silence, the kind that says everything. When he left, he didn't say goodbye. He just nodded. She closed the door slowly, leaned her forehead against it, and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding since he arrived. Her hands trembled. Something had shifted, and it would never shift back. The next week unfolded like a slow-motion accident. Everything looked normal from a distance. Appointments were attended, vitamins were taken, polite messages exchanged. But underneath it all, something vital had cracked. Claire started to show signs of suspicion, though she never voiced them directly. She became more observant, her eyes lingering on Hannah's face longer than necessary, her tone a little too controlled, her silences too calculated. Once she asked if Daniel had dropped by that week. Hannah lied. "No, just a text." Claire nodded without comment but didn't blink. Hannah felt her stomach twist. The weight of what hadn't happened, but almost had, pressed against her. Every moment. It wasn't just about Daniel anymore. It was about the entire structure they'd built, now teetering on foundations that couldn't hold. Hannah began to avoid looking in mirrors. She no longer trusted the reflection. Was she still the woman who wanted to help a couple become a family? Or was she the woman now quietly dreaming of a life she was never meant to have? The worst part wasn't the guilt, it was the longing. It came in waves. She would hear a song, smell something familiar, or feel the baby roll inside her, and she'd imagine a future that didn't exist. One where she wasn't just the surrogate. One where Daniel wasn't taken. One where love wasn't a betrayal. But reality was louder than dreams. During a routine checkup, Claire insisted on joining Hannah in the exam room, which she rarely did anymore. She held Hannah's hand during the scan and smiled at the heartbeat, but her grip was too tight, too performative. When the technician left, Claire stayed seated. "Do you ever forget this isn't your baby?" she asked, tone even, eyes locked on the screen still flickering with the last image. Hannah blinked, caught off guard. "No," she said too quickly. "I know the role. I haven't forgotten." Claire didn't nod, didn't smile, just stared at her for one long, excruciating moment before replying, "Good, because neither have I." That was when Hannah knew. Claire had sensed everything. Maybe not the details, maybe not the visits, but the shift, the warmth that didn't belong, the invisible thread stretching across something sacred. And now, that thread was burning, one spark away from snapping. Claire didn't bring it up again, but she didn't need to. Her silence became a language of its own, one that spoke through glances, pauses, and the way she lingered just a second longer when entering a room Hannah was in. She began showing up unannounced, once with herbal tea, another time with a "just checking in" excuse. But it wasn't about care anymore. It was surveillance disguised as concern. Hannah felt it in her bones. Claire was circling like someone watching the walls of her home for the first signs of collapse. Daniel, for his part, withdrew. He texted less. When he did appear, he was quieter, still kind, but hollowed. One evening he arrived with a bag of groceries Claire had supposedly forgotten to send. He didn't come in. He didn't look Hannah in the eyes. He handed her the bag and simply said, "Be careful," before walking away. That was all. 2 words, but they hit like thunder. Be careful. Was it a warning? A farewell? Hannah stood at her doorway for several minutes after, holding the groceries like they weighed more than she could carry. She realized something then. She wasn't the only one hurting. Claire was unraveling quietly, in that dignified, terrifying way that people do when they still believe they have something left to lose. And Daniel? He was already lost, not to one woman or another, but to the silence between them all. The pregnancy had stopped being about joy long ago. It had become a battleground, unspoken and fragile, where love, guilt, and loyalty twisted into something none of them could name. That night, Hannah lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling the baby move like waves under her skin. She whispered, an apology into the dark, unsure of who it was for. Claire? Daniel? Herself? Maybe all 3. Or maybe just the child, still untouched by the complications that had wrapped around them like roots. She thought of leaving, of stepping back, vanishing before anything shattered completely. But she knew it wouldn't work, because the damage wasn't ahead. It was already done. And now, the only question left was how far the fallout would reach, and who it would destroy first. 3 days later, Claire showed up with a box of baby clothes, pastel onesies, tiny socks, little hats, all folded perfectly, each piece holding the scent of lavender. She smiled as she unpacked them in Hannah's living room, speaking casually about nursery themes and bottle brands, but there was something forced in her cheer, a rehearsed kindness. Hannah sat across from her, legs crossed, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She felt like a guest in her own home, like she was watching a performance written just for her. Claire laid a pale blue blanket across Hannah's couch, then finally turned to her and asked, "Do you ever wonder what kind of mother you'll be?" The question caught Hannah off guard. I won't be raising him." Claire nodded slowly. "Right. Of course." Then she sat down, her hands smoothing out invisible creases in her skirt. The silence stretched. "But you've bonded with him." "That's normal," Claire continued. "It happens. Skin, blood, time. It creates something, even if it's not supposed to stay." Hannah didn't reply. There was no safe answer. Claire leaned in slightly, her voice softer now. "Just don't confuse that bond with something else. With someone else." The air grew heavier. The living room, once a place of quiet, now felt like a stage where every breath could echo forever. Hannah's throat tightened. Her chest ached with unsaid words. She wanted to scream the truth, or deny everything, or run, but she did nothing. Claire stood up, collected the empty box, and walked to the door. Before she opened it, she turned back one last time. "I love this child," she said, voice calm but edged with steel. "I will raise him, I will protect him, and whatever's happened, whatever's still happening, ends now." Then she left. No shouting, no accusations, just certainty, the kind that didn't need evidence to be true. Hannah stood frozen in place, unable to breathe for a moment. The weight of what had been unspoken now hung like fog in the room. She had been warned, not threatened, not punished, just warned. And that, somehow, was more terrifying. Because it meant Claire still believed she had something left to lose. And Hannah wasn't sure anymore if she did. The silence that followed Claire's visit wasn't peaceful. It was loaded. Every hour that passed felt like the edge of something sharp, brushing against Hannah's thoughts. She tried to continue her routine. She made tea, cleaned the apartment, folded laundry, answered emails. But none of it felt real. She was moving through a world that had cracked beneath her feet, trying to pretend it still held. Daniel didn't come. No messages, no missed calls. And strangely, that hurt more than if he had confronted her. His silence wasn't distance, it was resignation. Like he had chosen a side without saying so. Hannah stood in front of the mirror late that night, hands on her swollen belly. The baby moved, steady and calm. A reminder of life continuing, even as everything else unraveled. She whispered again, "I'm sorry." And this time, she meant it not as a confession, but a surrender. The truth was, love had bloomed in the wrong garden. She had mistaken care for connection, loneliness for fate. And while Daniel may have shared those feelings, neither of them had the right to carry them forward. Not with a child at the center. Not with Claire holding the pieces together with shaking hands and a spine of steel. Hannah knew what had to be done. She picked up the phone and dialed. Claire answered, her voice firm. "Hello?" There was a pause before Hannah said, "I'd like to move out for the last few weeks. I think it's best if we create space. For all of us." Claire didn't ask why. She just said, "Okay." And for the first time, Hannah felt something shift. Not in grief, but in clarity. She wasn't escaping. She was letting go. Letting go of a fantasy. Of a man who couldn't love two women without breaking both. Of the illusion that she could rewrite her place in this story. She began packing the next day, quietly, folding maternity dresses and baby books into boxes with trembling hands. Not out of shame, but out of understanding. Because some love stories aren't meant to be lived. Some are meant to be learned from. And this one, hers, was finally ready to close its chapter. Not with rage, not even with regret, but with the stillness that follows a storm, when the rebuilding begins. The day she left, rain tapped gently against the windows, as if the sky itself was softening around her decision. Hannah moved slowly, deliberately, as though every item she packed held a memory that needed to be honored before being put away. She didn't expect anyone to come. But as she zipped up her final bag, a soft knock came at the door. It was Daniel. He stood there in the hallway, hair damp from the rain, holding nothing. No umbrella, no apology, just his presence, quiet, unresolved, human. She let him in without a word. They sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, 2 cups of tea steaming between them like an offering neither dared to touch. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said finally. "I know," Hannah replied. He looked older than she remembered, worn, fractured. "But it did," he added. She nodded. "And we let it." A long pause stretched between them. No accusations, no pleading. Just truth, sitting plainly between 2 people who had already lost more than they could carry. Daniel ran a hand through his hair and whispered, "I care about you. I always will." Hannah's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Not this time. "Caring isn't always enough," she said softly, "especially when someone else is paying the price." He looked down, guilt weighing on every line of his face. "Claire deserves better," he admitted. Hannah reached across the table, placed her hand on his and said, "So do you. But we don't get to rewrite this ending. Not without breaking someone who stayed." She didn't say goodbye when he stood to leave. Neither did he. It was an ending without a ribbon, without closure. Just understanding. A silent farewell in the way their hands let go too slowly, like they were both still holding on to a version of themselves that never quite existed. After he left, Hannah sat alone with the quiet. And in that stillness, for the first time, she felt peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because it was finally done. Love hadn't been her mistake. Believing it would save her had been. Now she could start over. Not as the surrogate, not as the woman who almost loved the wrong man, but as herself. Whole, unwritten. Weeks later, Hannah gave birth alone in a quiet clinic outside the city. No cameras, no waiting room full of flowers, just her, the nurses, and the steady pulsing rhythm of new life arriving. She didn't ask for Daniel. She didn't ask for Claire. The decision had already been made. When they handed her the child, she held him for just a moment longer than she thought she could. His eyes blinked open, dark, searching. He looked like none of them. He looked like himself, a blank page. Hannah smiled through tears, kissed his forehead and whispered, "You're safe." Then she handed him gently to the nurse and turned, away before she changed her mind. The papers had already been signed. The family would be waiting. Claire would be waiting. And though Hannah had vanished from their lives without asking for anything in return, she left behind the only thing that mattered. Love unentangled from possession. As she stepped outside into the late spring air, a breeze caught the edge of her coat, and for the first time in months, she felt light. Not healed, but lighter. The ache hadn't disappeared. It had simply settled. She walked to the nearby bench and sat for a while, watching the wind move through the trees, thinking of how silence had always filled the gaps between them. Not words, not promises, just silence. And in that silence, she had found something unexpected. Herself. A woman who had carried more than just a child. She had carried truth, longing, and eventually, release. The kind that doesn't come with a grand goodbye or dramatic closure, but through quiet strength, through letting go before love turns into something cruel. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope addressed in her own handwriting. To Claire. Inside was a simple letter. No confessions, no explanations. Just a thank you for trusting her, for holding space when everything cracked, and for loving the child the way Hannah no longer could. She left the envelope with the nurse. No return address, just a gesture. And as she walked toward the bus stop at the edge of town, the sun broke through the clouds, briefly warming her skin. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Some goodbyes don't echo. They simply end.